The referral came in through email, and I almost didn't take it. My schedule was already full, but the sender wrote like he knew me, said a colleague had mentioned I was good with anxiety cases. I read it twice and figured, sure, I can fit one more in. That was the first one. Her name was Reba, mid-30s, worked in tech recruiting, sat in my chair with her hands folded so tight her knuckles went white. She talked about not being able to sleep, not being able to eat unless someone told her it was okay to eat. She said someone a lot without naming them. I did what I always do. I listened. I took notes. I set a treatment plan. My office is on the second floor of a building on 17th Street, downtown Denver, between a dental practice and a place that used to be a yoga studio before the pandemic ate it. Small waiting room, one plant I keep alive out of spite, 2 chairs and a machine that plays rain sounds. I've been in that room since 2016. The second referral came 6 weeks later. Same sender, this time with a note that just said, another one who could use you. His name was Cody, 20s, delivery driver, kept his coat on for the first 3 sessions. He told me he was struggling with what he called leaving, but wouldn't say leaving what. He'd tear up and change the subject. He asked me once if I thought a person could tell what was in another person's heart just by looking at them. I said no. He looked disappointed. By the time the third one came, I still hadn't put anything together. That's the part I want to say honestly. I've been doing this almost 15 years, and I missed it. Her name was Priya. She was the one who first made me stop and think, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. She spoke in a specific cadence, soft, patient, like she was translating each sentence out of a language I didn't speak. She said she was having trouble making decisions on her own. Not big decisions, small ones. What to eat for lunch, whether to buy new shoes when the old ones wore through. She said, and I wrote this down word for word, I've never had to think alone before. I asked her what she meant. She looked at the rain sound machine for about 10 seconds. I lived with people who did the thinking for us, she said, not in a bad way, in a helpful way. I asked her where they lived. She smiled a little. Said something about a house in the foothills, and then she moved on before I could ask more. And by the time I remembered to circle back, the session was over. 2 more came in over the next 3 months. A man in his 40s named Wes, who cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could come up the stairs. And a young woman, Mika, who wouldn't sit in the chair facing the window because she said windows made her nervous, though she couldn't say why. All 5 of them referred by the same person. I want to be careful describing him. At the time, I didn't think anything of him. He was a family physician who'd sent me patients before. Regular channel. I'd met him once at a continuing education thing, shook his hand, forgot his face within a week. His previous referrals had always been fine, regular cases, nothing that made me look twice. So it wasn't him I was suspicious of, not yet. It was the sameness of what I was hearing. I do my case notes on Thursdays. I close the office at 4, make coffee, and I write. I'd started doing my notes longhand a year earlier because typing them was making me sloppy. I'd sit with the file open and read back what I'd written the week before, and I'd add to it. That night, a Thursday in early March 2022, I was working through Wes's file, and I stopped on a sentence I'd underlined. The place up the canyon, where we all lived like a family. The word canyon caught me, because Priya had said foothills, because Cody had said once that he'd left the property, because Mika had told me, offhand, that she used to live in the mountains with a big group. I got up and pulled all 5 files. I sat on the floor of my office, which I don't do, and I read every note I'd taken on all of them, cover to cover. It took me until almost 9 at night. The plant on the desk needed water, and I didn't get up to do it. They weren't describing the same place with the same words. That's the part I want to say clearly. If they had, I'd have caught it in the first session. They were describing it in 5 different vocabularies, but the shape of it was identical. A house, or a compound, or a property, somewhere west, up in the canyons, past Golden or maybe further. They weren't sure or wouldn't say. A group of people who lived there, a man who ran it. None of them named him the same way. Reba called him the one who helped us. Cody said our teacher. Priya said the man at the head of the table. Wes said him. Mika said dad, and then corrected herself and said, not my real dad, obviously. They all described being told what to eat. They all described being told when to sleep. They all described a period, always about a year in, when they were told they were ready for something more. And after that, they weren't allowed to leave the property without a partner. None of them had left cleanly. All 5, in their own way, had gotten out through some crisis. Cody's mother had shown up at the gate. Priya had been hospitalized for an infection and never went back. Wes just walked in the middle of the night with no shoes on and got picked up by a rancher on the highway. They had all been referred to me within the same 11 months. I sat there a long time. The light in the room went from that ugly, late afternoon orange to nothing, and I didn't turn on the lamp. Here was my problem. I couldn't tell anyone. Not the way it would matter. Everything they'd said to me was under confidentiality. Even the fact that they'd all been referred by the same doctor was, technically, protected. I couldn't call the police and say, hey, 5 of my clients described the same place and the same man. I couldn't call a reporter. I couldn't even tell another therapist over drinks. And I didn't know for sure. That was the other part. I had a shape, not a name. I had a canyon and a table, and a man who was called Dad and Teacher and He. It could have been 3 different places. It could have been coincidence, except I knew it wasn't. I sat with it for a week. I saw Reba on Monday and I couldn't look at her the same way. I saw Cody on Tuesday and I noticed for the first time that he still flinched when a car door slammed in the parking lot outside. I hadn't put that together with anything before. Now I couldn't stop seeing it. What I did was this. There's an organization that tracks high control groups. They take anonymous tips. I sat down on a Saturday and I wrote them a letter. No names, no identifying details. I described the patterns, the referral chain, the vocabulary, the way 5 people had, across almost a year, described the same shape of a place. I mailed it. I didn't hear back. I kept working. That was the thing I decided early on and never let myself lose. My job wasn't to be the person who cracked this open. My job was the hour in front of me. Cody learning to eat lunch without calling someone first. Priya making a decision about her own shoes. Reba sleeping 4 hours, then 5, then 6. Almost 6 months later, in September, I got an email from Wes. He said he'd been contacted by someone from the organization I'd written to. He said he'd talked to them for a long time. He said he wanted me to know he'd given them permission to use what he'd told them, and that he was going to talk to a reporter next. He wanted to know if I was okay with that. I wrote him back that it was his story to tell. The investigation, when it opened, took another year to become public, and by then, 2 other people had come forward, neither of them my clients. I never learned exactly what happened up in that canyon. I don't need to. I'm not the person who needed to know. The referrals from that doctor stopped around the time Wes went public. I don't know if he knew. I don't know what he knew. I have guesses, and I keep them to myself because guesses are not what I get paid for. I still see Cody. He drives a different route now. He came in last month and told me he'd gone to a diner by himself and ordered whatever he wanted off the menu without asking anyone. And he cried, telling me about it. I didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't a better thing to say than the quiet. That's the hour. That's the work. I've been running heavy equipment since I was 19, and there's one job in Atlanta I never put on my resume. It was July of 2021, a mixed-use build off Memorial Drive, one of those lots that had been sitting empty behind a chain-link fence for as long as anyone could remember. Weeds up to your waist, faded plywood over what used to be a foundation. The kind of parcel that changes hands 4 times before somebody finally does something with it. I ran a Cat 320. Not new, but I'd been on it long enough that I could tell you which hydraulic line was going to weep before it did. The GC that summer was a company out of Marietta, and the site super was a guy named Ray. Ray was maybe 60, thin, always had a can of Grizzly in his back pocket, and he wore the same faded blue polo 4 days a week. He wasn't mean exactly, he just didn't waste words. We started the foundation dig on a Monday. Atlanta in July is not a place for humans. By 8 in the morning, the cab of the 320 was already 90-something degrees, even with the AC blasting, and the red clay came up in heavy, wet clods that stuck to the bucket and had to be knocked off with the boom. I remember the smell more than anything. Wet clay smells like a penny in your mouth, that coppery mineral thing that gets into your clothes. We were maybe 8 feet down on the north side of the lot when I felt it. If you've never run an excavator, I don't know how to describe it exactly. You feel the ground through the bucket the way a dentist feels a tooth through the pick. Soil has a give, rock has a bounce. What I hit had neither. It was solid the way a floor is solid, and the whole machine kind of shuddered up through the tracks and into my seat. I stopped, backed the bucket out, cleared the loose stuff, went back in gentler. Same thing, not one rock, a line. I climbed down and walked over to the edge of the cut. There was maybe a 2-foot section exposed where I'd scraped the clay off, and even from up there I could tell it wasn't natural. It was courses, stones laid on top of stones, and something between them that had turned to the same color as the dirt, but wasn't dirt. I called Ray on the radio. He came over in his little white Ranger, took his sunglasses off, and stood at the lip of the cut for a long time without saying anything. He wasn't looking at the wall, exactly. He was looking at the whole cut, front to back, like he was measuring something in his head. How deep you go? About 8. And that's the top of it. Looks like. He nodded once, spit. Then he did something I still think about. He walked back to his truck, sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the AC running, and made a phone call. He was on it for maybe 6 minutes. I couldn't hear a word. When he got out, he came back over and said, "You're gonna dig around it." I asked him what he meant. The wall ran, best I could tell, straight across the north end of the footprint. We had drawings. The footings were supposed to go right through there. You dig around it. You don't touch it. Don't chip it. Don't put the teeth on it. 5-foot buffer. You go around. Understand? What about the prints? Prints are gonna change. I said, okay. What are you gonna say? I climbed back in, and by lunch I'd sketched out in my head how I was going to do it. Ray came back after lunch with a can of orange spray paint and marked a line in the dirt above where the wall was. He added a foot to my buffer on his own. 6 feet, not 5. Now here's the thing. I've hit stuff before. Everybody has. Old sewer laterals, forgotten storage tanks, one time a car. Once out near Douglasville, we came up on a family cemetery nobody had on file, and that whole job got shut down for 3 weeks while people in ties argued about it. That's what you expect. Somebody comes out, somebody takes pictures, there's paperwork. Nobody came out. No archaeologist, no city inspector, no cops. Ray made a call, and by the end of the day, the drawings on the trailer wall had a fresh red pen line on them where the north footing had moved. It moved 6 feet south. That was it. I worked around that wall for 8 days. By the 3rd day, I'd exposed maybe 40 feet of it on the top side. It was, I'd guess, 4 feet thick. The stones weren't dressed the way old church foundations are. They were bigger, rougher, and the mortar between them was almost black. It didn't look like anything I'd seen in Georgia. Georgia's got its share of old brick, its share of fieldstone foundations from farms that got swallowed by the city, but that wasn't either. The courses were too even for fieldstone and too crude for anything Victorian. The other thing was, it wasn't a wall in the sense of one side of a building. It was a wall in the sense of enclosing something. On day 5, I extended the cut on the west side, still keeping my 6-foot buffer, and I could see the corner of it. It turned 90 degrees, clean, and it kept going south, back under where we hadn't dug yet. I asked one of the guys on the ground crew, an older man we all called Pop, if he'd ever seen anything like it. Pop had been in Atlanta concrete since the 70s. He looked at it for a while and said, "I seen a lot of old, son. I ain't seen that old." I said, "How old you think?" "I ain't guessing. That ain't a guessing kind of thing." Then he walked off and got a bottle of water. That was the tone the whole job. Nobody talked about it, but nobody looked at it either. When guys came down into the cut to set forms, they kept their eyes on the forms. When the concrete truck pulled up on day 9, the driver, a guy I'd seen on maybe 20 jobs, wouldn't back up close to my side of the cut. He said the ground was soft. It wasn't. I'd rolled a compactor over it that morning. I'll tell you one thing that happened that I don't have a clean explanation for, and then I'll stop, because I'm not going to make this something it wasn't. Night of day 6, I was locking up the machine. Sun was down. The site had that orange-purple color Atlanta gets in July after a thunderstorm, and the air was still steaming off the clay. I walked past the cut on my way to the gate, and I looked down at the wall the way you'd glance at a coworker you don't want to talk to. There was water pooled at the base of it, on the exposed side, maybe 2 inches, from the storm. The rest of the cut was dry. Same clay, same grade, 20 feet away, dry. I walked the perimeter of the pit twice to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Just at the base of the wall, in a strip about a foot wide, standing water. Nowhere else. I didn't tell anybody. What are you gonna say? Ray, the water's weird. And he'd have looked at me the way he looked at everything. And he'd have said what he always said, which was some version of, that's not something we need to worry about. We poured footings on day 10. The engineer had redrawn the whole north side, so the load transferred around the wall instead of through it. On the drawings, it just looked like a design choice, a jog in the foundation. If you didn't know why it was there, you'd assume it was for a utility easement or a soils issue. We put a slab over the top of it on day 14. There was a moment right before the pour where the wall was still visible under our forms, and I remember standing at the edge of the deck, looking straight down at it. The mortar looked wetter than it had any business looking. Then the pump truck started and the concrete came in, and that was the end of me seeing it. Building went up over the next 14 months. I moved on to a job in Alpharetta after our part wrapped. I heard through a guy that the final as-builts didn't show anything unusual on the north side. Not the jog in the footing, not the extra rebar we tied in. On paper, it looks like a normal foundation. Whatever showed up in the drawings after Ray's phone call, it didn't survive to the last set. I don't know if that's normal. I know it's not normal. I drive by the place sometimes when I'm on that side of town. It's a leasing office and some ground floor retail now, with apartments stacked on top. A juice place, a nail salon, one of those insurance offices where nobody ever seems to go in. Whenever I'm sitting at that light on Memorial, I look at the corner of the building where the north wall would be, and I do the math in my head. 6 feet south of the exterior wall, 8 feet down. Right about where the tile changes color in front of the juice place, if you're standing at the counter. There's a wall down there. Somebody put it in the ground a long time ago, on purpose, and somebody else, when we found it, made a phone call and made sure it stayed there. I did what I was told. I dug around it. I didn't touch it. I don't know what's inside it. Sometimes when I'm sitting at that light, I think about the water. 2 inches at the base, dry everywhere else. And I think about Ray in his truck with the door open, on the phone for 6 minutes, not looking at me and not looking at the wall. I think about who he was calling. August of 2021. One of those weeks where Detroit sits under a lid of gray heat, and you can smell the river even from 6 blocks away. We were working off Mack Avenue, East Side, tearing down a row of houses the city had finally given up on. Most had been empty since the early 2000s, some longer. Our crew was small, 4 guys plus me. Foreman was a heavy guy we called Tank, 60 years old, hands like catcher's mitts. Then Reggie, quiet, always chewing sunflower seeds. A younger kid named Mateo, maybe 22, still had that jumpy energy where you could tell he hadn't been on a real site long. And Doug, who ran the skid steer and complained about his back. I was the interior guy. That meant I went in first with a pry bar and a sledge before the big equipment came in. Pull anything worth pulling. Copper, fixtures, sometimes cabinets if a salvage guy had put an order in. Then knock down the interior walls so the machines could take the rest cleanly. The house that day was a 2-story on a corner lot. Brick on the first floor, wood siding on the second. The kind of place that had probably been beautiful in 1930. Now the porch sagged. Windows were boarded. Front door had 3 padlocks from 3 different city departments. Always a bad sign, because it means people have been in and out. Tank cut the locks. I went in with a flashlight and a respirator, because the mold in these places can put you in the hospital. Inside it smelled like wet drywall and old wood. Sunlight came through gaps in the boards in these long, dusty bars. Wallpaper was peeling in ribbons. Somebody had spray painted a smiley face on the living room ceiling, which I always find worse than scary graffiti. Something cheerful in an empty house is off in a way I can't explain. I did the usual sweep. Kitchen first, pulled the copper from under the sink. Bathroom next. Upstairs, I got 2 decent cast iron radiators loose and dragged them down to the porch for Doug to load. Nothing weird, just another sad house. The wall was on the first floor, between what used to be the dining room and what used to be a back parlor. I noticed it because the layout was off. If you stood in the dining room and looked at the back wall, it should have been maybe 14 feet to the exterior. But when I stepped outside and paced it along the foundation, I got closer to 20. I checked it twice. Then I told Tank. Tank came in, chewing a toothpick, and looked at the wall. He rapped it with his knuckles, hollow. "Yeah," he said. "Somebody built over something. Probably a pantry they sealed up. Happens." He shrugged and went back out. That was Tank. 40 years of demo. Nothing surprised him. I put my sledge through the drywall at about waist height. The first swing went in easy, way easier than a real interior wall. Second swing opened it up to the studs. There was no insulation, just black air on the other side. I widened the hole with the pry bar until I could get my head and shoulder through. Then I clicked my flashlight on and leaned in. The room was maybe 8 feet by 10. No windows. Walls were plaster, painted a color that used to be light green and had turned the color of an old tooth. The floor was hardwood, same as the rest of the house, but clean. There was no dust on the floor. In a house sealed 20 years, that's the thing your brain trips on first. In the middle of the room was a table, a regular dining table, dark wood, maybe from the 40s by the shape of the legs. 4 chairs, one on each side, and the table was set. Not roughly. Set. Cloth napkins folded into triangles. A plate at each seat. Silverware laid out proper. Fork on the left, knife and spoon on the right. Water glasses. In the middle, a serving dish with a lid on it and a smaller bowl next to it. There was food on the plates, or what used to be food. Now it was black and shrunken and had that dry, papery look old food gets when there hasn't been any moisture around it for a long time. I couldn't tell what any of it had been. No bugs, no mice, no mouse droppings, nothing. I stood there in the hole with my flashlight and I didn't move for a full minute. Then I saw the cards. On each plate, in front of the food, was a folded piece of paper, like a name card at a wedding. White paper, gone yellow at the edges, written in fountain pen, that dark, reddish-brown color old ink gets after decades. The one closest to me said Walter. I climbed the rest of the way through the hole. My boot hit the clean floor and left a print in nothing because there was nothing on the floor to disturb. A sealed room in a house has dust. This one didn't. I walked around the table. Walter. Then to his left, Ellis. Across from Walter, Marguerite. Written out full like that, with the flourish on the M, old-fashioned handwriting, the kind my grandmother used on Christmas cards. The 4th card was on the plate closest to the hole I'd just come through. I hadn't seen it from the outside because it was angled away. I picked it up. It had my first name on it. Not a common name, not John or Mike. My actual name, the one on my driver's license, spelled correctly, in the same brown ink and same slanted hand as the other 3. The paper was the same yellow. I stood there with the card in my hand and I could hear my own breathing inside the respirator. That's the part I remember most clearly. Not fear exactly, something quieter, like when you realize you're lost and you haven't admitted it to yourself yet. I set the card back down where I found it. I don't know why. It felt important to put it back exactly. Then I went outside. Tank was leaning on the truck, drinking a Gatorade. Reggie was on the tailgate. Mateo and Doug were around back, moving debris. "Come here a second," I said. Tank looked at my face and put the Gatorade down. All 4 came inside. I pointed at the hole and let them look. Tank went first, then Reggie, then Doug. Mateo went last and came out fast, and stood in the dining room with his hand over his mouth. Nobody talked for a while. Doug finally said, "That your name?" I said yes. He said, "You ever been in this house before?" I said no. I'd never been on this block before that morning. Checked the address twice on the drive over because I didn't know the neighborhood. Tank came back through the hole and dusted off his shirt, which didn't need dusting off because again, there was no dust in there. "House been empty how long?" he said, to nobody in particular. Reggie pulled up something on his phone. City records. Last occupant moved out in 2001. Been on the demo list since 2014. 20 years. We stood around the hole in the wall like people standing around a grave. Nobody wanted to be the first one to say something stupid. Tank finally said, "We're on a schedule." I looked at him. He said, "I ain't calling the cops on a table." That was true, in a way I couldn't argue with. There was no body, no crime, just a room somebody had bricked over with dinner still on the plates. What were we going to say, and to who? Doug ran the skid steer through the back wall an hour later. He took the whole thing down at once, and it all went into the dumpster with the rest of the house. The plates went every direction. I saw my card flutter out and land face down in the pile. I didn't pick it up. We finished the house before sundown. Nobody talked about it on the ride back to the yard. Mateo quit the next week. Tank retired that fall, though he'd been talking about retiring for 2 years, so maybe it wasn't related. I went home that night and I looked up the 3 names. Walter. I found him fast. Died 1978. Heart attack. Lived at that address from 1962 until his death. Ellis. Died in 1994. Cancer. Also lived at that address. 2nd floor room, rented from Walter's widow. Marguerite took me longer because the spelling was uncommon. She died in 2001. She was the last person to live there. The one who moved out, sort of. She died in the front bedroom and it took the neighbors a week to notice the mail piling up. 3 people. 3 real people. All of them had lived in that house. All of them had died. The ink on the cards was old. I've done enough demo in old houses to know what old paper looks like and what old ink looks like when it's been sitting sealed away from light for decades. That card was not made recently. I am 41 years old. I was born 8 years after Walter died. I don't know what to do with that. I've turned it over for 2 years and I still don't know. Someone sat down in that house, probably in Marguerite's last years, and wrote out 4 cards for a dinner that was already impossible because 2 of the guests had been dead for decades. Then they wrote my name on the 4th card, sealed the room, and either walked out or didn't. I still work demo. I still open up walls. Every time I put a sledge through drywall in an old house, I wait a half second before I lean in with the flashlight. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Some kind of sign, maybe, that this one's fine. So far, every one of them has been fine.